So for this podcast, it would be helpful if you turn to page 422 in Myers. There's a section, the second paragraph, I believe, under the Cannon-Barr theory where he mentions spinal cord injuries. And some students over the years have told me they find it a little bit confusing. So before we get into the spinal cord injuries, let's make sure we're a little bit clear on James Lange versus the Cannon-Barr theory. So remember, for James Lange, we have a stimulus and basically emotion, the conscious emotion of fear, in this case fear, follows the physiological arousal. And that physiological arousal is connected to the autonomic nervous system and specifically to the sympathetic nervous system. And if you turn to page 88, you can review the sympathetic nervous system. There are organs associated with the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so basically, for James Lange, emotion arises from physiological arousal. Cannon-Barr actually, both Cannon and his student Barr, they actually critique this because they thought that the biological signatures, what they called it, for our emotions were too similar. We talked about that in class today, how when you're really euphoric, say because you're falling in love, you will have heart palpitations and maybe an increase in perspiration. That can be the same physiological, the same symptoms that are associated with fear and dread, right? And when we feel anxious, which is usually the result of fear. So Cannon and Barr were like, wait a minute, something else is going on here, because if it was just physiological arousal, how would we ever be able to sort through have all of these different emotions? So what they actually put forth was that the information from the stimulus goes to our thalamus. Simultaneously, our thalamus sends that information to the ANS, just like up here, right? And to the cortex, or the cortices, right? Like the frontal cortex. And it's in the frontal cortex where you can see this is where the arousal happens. And this is where the conscious experience of the emotion happens. And it contends that this happens simultaneously. Okay, so this happens simultaneously. It's like two separate tracks. Okay, so here's the million-dollar questions. If emotions can be experienced without feedback from the sympathetic organs to the cortex, which theory is most weakened, James Lange or Cannon-Barr? So if emotions can be experienced without feedback from the sympathetic organs to the cortex, which theory is most weakened? So please actually try to answer this question. You can put me on pause, right? Well, the answer is James Lange, right? Because James Lange theory, again, it believes that the emotion, right, follows the arousal. Basically, the physiological arousal causes the conscious emotion, so in this case, fear, to happen. So if this is cut off, if this is no longer, say, God forbid, we're paralyzed from the neck down, well, none of this ever reaches the brain, right? Because he's not saying the brain's not involved at all, right? But even if we wouldn't feel this, right? Because these nerves are no longer working. So what actually did happen when they started to study spinal cord injuries? Well, they split it up. Myers splits it up between what he calls high injuries, and those are people paralyzed from the neck down. And then lower injuries, those are people paralyzed from the waist down, or sometimes the legs are the only part of the body that are paralyzed. And what was interesting is, for the most part, there's a caveat here, just make sure you read the book. I'm only going to go through one part. Many people with the high injuries did report actually less intense emotions. So basically their anger didn't feel quite as intense as it did prior to their injury. People with the lower injuries did not experience any significant change in the intensity and the experience of their emotions pre and post injury. So my question for you is, does this finding strengthen or weaken James Lange? Does it strengthen James Lange? Does it weaken James Lange? Does it strengthen Cannon-Bard, or does it weaken Cannon-Bard? That's the question that we have to answer. So I'm going to give you some time, right? You're going to pause me and you're going to try to answer this question. Okay. So we've already established this. If people with spinal cord injuries experience emotion, this weakens the James Lange theory, right? Because basically physiological arousal from the ANS was responsible for the conscious experience of emotion, right? And it would basically suggest that we don't need feedback from ANS, right? And you could still get away with having an emotion with Cannon-Bard because Cannon-Bard believes that the thalamus sends information to the cortex, which would still happen if one was paralyzed. So we could still have the experience of an emotion. So the people with the high injuries, right, experience weakened emotions. This supports James Lange. This supports James Lange, right? Because the emotion, the experience of the emotion did actually weaken. And this challenges Cannon-Bard, right? Because Cannon-Bard basically believed that the cortex by itself was where the conscious experience of emotion happened. Obviously, there is a connection between the ANS and what's going on in the brain where we have the conscious experience, okay? So you can read the rest of this and hopefully that'll give you some input into what we're talking about. This might be something you have to practice and go over again and again, but remember, you can watch it and stop it and start it as you see fit. All right, so we went over spinal cord injuries and the two theories of emotion.